everybody. Just be patient. Oh, it looks like we are now live on Facebook. So are you ready to start, Chris?
I think we are. Thank you, Shelley.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this budget update. I am State Senator Shelley Mayer, commonly known as Shelley. I represent the 37th Senate District. It does go from the Bronx border in Yonkers to Bedford, and therefore tonight I'm so pleased to be here with my colleague, Assemblyman Chris Burdick, a fantastic new colleague. I'm so pleased. I worked closely with him when he was supervisor in the town of Bedford, but now he is a very effective assemblyman in year one of his term. So we're going to talk about the budget for about 20-25 minutes on various parts that are most essential, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So with that, I will let you say some brief remarks, Chris, before we get going.
Well, first, thank you for those kind words. And it's really a pleasure to be in the assembly. And I have to say that from the very get-go, I was working with Shelley and also with Pete Harcum on the Senate side. And I have to tell you, it's just great to have such seasoned people who are so effective in what they're doing. And I'm much more capable of being able to get things done for my district. My district covers the northern Westchester portion of Westchester County and going all the way up to the Putnam line. It's formerly the district of David Buchwald. I succeeded David. And it goes down and it includes about half of White Plains. And it's great to be here and working hard, doing my best to try to help people in the district. Shelley, back to you.
Okay, well, thank you. So we've divided the sort of the highlights to start. We'll talk a little bit about two particular areas of importance. Then we'll go back to a few other areas and then open it up for questions. So it really was, so I'm chair of the State Senate Education Committee, which means I have responsibility with my colleagues of really sort of leading the charge with my assembly colleagues for funding for our schools. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we achieved, which was quite historic in this budget. What we were able to push back against some of the governor's original proposals, and talk a little bit about what it means for the schools in our district. As you recall, because of COVID, obviously the governor and the state was very, very nervous this whole year about how much money the state would have. And also we were not confident that we would have federal money after the first COVID relief bill was passed last year. And when that COVID relief bill was passed last year, it was right before the budget. We used all of the COVID relief education money to basically offset what would have been the state's obligation. So all public schools in New York basically stayed the same amount of money in the last year as they were in the prior year. And then we came upon this year, and the governor threatened cuts during the course of the year. And then in December, he came out with his proposal, which was to basically cut public education funding and also to use, again, the money from the December stimulus and use that to offset the state's obligation to fund our schools. Now, a little bit of history, which is a little in the weeds, but in 2007, the state legislature, that's a long time ago, adopted what's called the foundation aid formula. And that's the basis for how schools are funded, public schools and non-public schools to some extent as well. The foundation aid formula was an effort to move away from politics being the driver of how schools were funded and to have a situation based on need. It was supposed to be funded over 4 years. It got 1 year, and then it sort of never got fully funded. This year, and I'll cut to the chase, we were able to get a commitment that over the next 3 years, this year plus 2 future years, we will fully fund the balance of the foundation aid formula. And so every district, pretty much every district, is owed money. And this year we added $1.4 billion in foundation aid, which is a 7.4% increase. And every district that was not up to 60% of foundation aid got up to 60%, and everyone will get to 80% next year and 100% thereafter. Foundation aid is not perfect. All districts are not treated the way they should, but it still is an effort that came out of a court case to have a sound basic education be the standard. So this year, 17 Westchester districts went up substantially, but every district went up at least 2%. And in addition, we were able to get the federal money from December and again from the American Rescue Act, which passed later, to go to schools. So almost all the schools in our district are going to get a significant amount of money from the state and from the federal government. The federal money is to be used for COVID-related school expenses, including learning loss, like summer school, additional psychologists and social workers, and things to help kids recoup from a year of being at home. Some of that money will be spread over 4 years and subject to limitations in the federal law, but the state money, they can begin to use as soon as it goes out the door to help them. And many schools in all of our districts have had a very tough year, and the more affluent ones have used their own money or raised money to meet the expenses. But obviously this federal money offsets some of those COVID-related expenses. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of education is the governor had proposed to use some of the STAR reimbursement that went to school districts, STAR being the basically reduction in property taxes for those who are eligible. We were able to reject that, which would have been a very substantial change in the way school districts are funded. And we want to move the burden away from property taxpayers for education and ultimately move it more to the state side so that you are not burdened with these incredible property taxes that we have here in Westchester. One other thing we did, and I know someone already asked a question about it, is we increased the number of slots for full day pre-K for 4-year-olds. The city of New York has full day pre-K for every child who's 4, regardless of income or anything else. But in the rest of the state, there's a small amount that has been subject to a competitive grant. We are changing that. We are going to begin to phase in where districts want it. Not every district wants it. We appreciate that. But for high need districts, particularly where there is a lot of evidence showing it makes a difference, we are going to be greatly expanding full day pre-K to over 200 new districts who are going to get some reimbursement with caveats to move forward. The third thing I want to mention is about digital equity and broadband. We are expanding broadband for families that are basically eligible for free and reduced lunch. Basically, the poorest families will be eligible for $15 a month broadband. I don't think that's good enough. I've been fighting for free broadband for every child, but this is what the compromise was, as well as a pot of $15 million that will help libraries and community-based organizations help people with broadband, with accessing computers, and for learning how to use remote learning and the internet more effectively. So there's a lot more in education, but I want to let Chris talk particularly about small business, and then maybe we can flip back to some of the other very important issues that we have.
Thank you, Shelley. And I think people do need to know that Shelley has for many, many years been an ardent proponent of funding for education and has just done such a tremendous job in her role as the chair of the Education Committee in the State Senate. And I'm confident that had it not been for her advocacy, we would not have this historic funding that is taking place. As Shelley had mentioned, this is taking a tremendous burden off of local taxpayers, because as we try to shift more of the cost of education to the state, then that eases the burden on our local school districts. And throughout the 93rd Assembly District, my district, every one of those school districts will be receiving increases in the state aid. And as Shelley had mentioned, it's being phased in for full foundation aid in 2 more years, a total of 3, with this one being the first, this coming one. So I want to talk a little bit about small business, because we know that a couple things about small business. And first of all, small business throughout New York State is such an incredible engine in the economy and does provide substantial employment. In fact, employment through small businesses really exceeds the number of employment of jobs that's created through larger corporations. And obviously, they had gotten slammed due to the pandemic. And so we're very fortunate that we had our congressional delegation and particularly U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer provide a good deal of funding for relief to the state, and in a number of areas. I think the total amount that came in on the state side, that doesn't even count the municipalities, is some 12.6 billion. And we have a big chunk of that in terms of a percentage of the overall is for small business and arts relief and recovery assistance and other pandemic relief. But just to stick for a moment to the small business, 1 billion is being provided to small business and arts relief and recovery assistance. And this is just an enormous pot of money, and it's going to be focused on those businesses, including both for-profit arts and cultural institutions that were impacted by the pandemic. That category of Small Business Recovery Grant Program, $800 million in that category. This is going to be administered by the Empire State Development Corporation, and which already has a program in place, and it's going to obviously substantially expand that. And obviously, we here in New York are really joined at the hip financially with New York City. And so we know that assistance to New York City, such as the restaurants and the theater district, is very important to the lifeblood and to the economic health of Westchester County. And so there's another $25 million out of that 1 billion that goes to New York Restaurant Resiliency Grant Program, again, to provide funding for restaurants that provide meals to distressed and underrepresented communities, and helping to get those restaurants back on their feet. Arts and Cultural Organization Recovery Grant Program, $40 million for that. And that's through the New York State Council on the Arts to eligible arts and cultural nonprofit organizations to assist in the recovery from the pandemic. I'm very pleased that we were able to get a special line item for Arts Westchester, and Shelley and other colleagues on the state Senate side for Westchester County were instrumental in getting $1 million for Arts Westchester, and we're delighted with that because they in turn really are supporting so many arts organizations throughout the county. So we're excited that we were able to get that in the budget. There's also a restaurant return to work tax credit, and that provides up to $35 million in tax credits to support restaurants hard hit in the pandemic through 2021. New York City musical and theatrical production tax credit. I was referencing the need to help our theater district, and that provides up to $100 million in tax credits to jumpstart the industry and support tourism activity in the city. We're also extending and enhancing the musical and theatrical production credit for another 4 years. Now, one of the things I should mention about these funding streams is that, the economists use the word the multiplier effect, meaning that if you put in $1, then how much does that affect the economy? And it's known that these programs will reverberate in the economy 3-4 times for each $1 that's invested. So from a taxpayer standpoint, this is a very productive use of taxpayer dollars that both helps to get our economy back on its feet, and also help other areas of the economy, not just those that are the small businesses that are going to be uh, uh, relieved and being given funding for getting back on their feet. So we're very excited with what the budget has in this area. And of course, Shelley's office and my office will be on hand to help those who want to take advantage of these programs just as soon as they get up and running. So I think with that, Shelley, I'll give it back to you.
Okay, thank you. And I see that this issue of closed captioning, I think we are adding it, and hopefully we can get that taken care of. And we should have done that from the onset, but hopefully we can fix that now. Thank you for pointing that out. A few other things I would like to talk about. One is roads and bridges, particularly Northern Westchester and the district where Chris and I overlap. I have thought for some time we have not invested sufficiently in our roads and bridges, nor have we given the municipalities the money they need, because they have some primary obligations for state roads that exist in their districts. And we were able, for really the first time, because the old politics were the MTA got money that was for New York City, and the upstate roads got money that was for upstate, and the suburbs sort of hung out there without really a lot of attention. And I think we're changing that. And we were able to get a 100 million increase in funding for CHIPS, which is the basic form of reimbursement for roads and bridges by the state. We got money for the Extreme Winter Recovery Program, which is when those storms create those incredible potholes that we all suffer through. We got additional money for paving. And we got some other capital investments that are quite important. I know somebody asked, and we'll get to that, about sidewalks, for example, in Bedford. But we were able to get substantial capital investments in many important projects, and we will be able to hopefully be allocated money that we can apply to capital projects in our district. Some of you may remember, I worked with Chris very much on getting money for 684 with David Buckwell to finally, after I think 20 years, get that repaved. That took one of these allocated forms of capital. We hope to do that again for particular projects, but overall, the commitment to roads and bridges was extremely important from my perspective. Another thing that we did is on higher education. We pushed back against efforts to raise tuition at SUNY and CUNY. We invested in increasing the amount of TAP, tuition assistance program dollars that students get, so that there's less of a gap between the TAP amount and the amount that it costs the college and university. We want to support SUNY and CUNY, including our community colleges, because they continue to be an affordable choice for so many of our students. And at the same time, we did also provide some money in Bundy aid, which goes to, in capital, to our private colleges and universities as well. So the investments we were able to make in our basic institutions, I think reflect, for those who've been around a long time, a shift in our thinking away from a year by year sort of what do we have to cut in order to survive, to what can we invest in to bring New York back strongly after COVID. And I think it was that sense of investment that really drove our decision making. So for example, in the small business, I just want to add to one thing Chris said, that 800 million is grants, not loans, 800 million in grants to small businesses. And I know I walked around a number of small businesses in my district that stayed open, but barely open, made $40 a day. We need to help those folks with grants so that they can come back strong and hire our employees. So I think the small business part is quite important. I'm very, very pleased about that. You mentioned the arts. I do want to mention healthcare, and then I'll go back to you, Chris, and then we'll take some questions. So Unquestionably, the experience of COVID laid bare that we have some problems and challenges in our nursing home world that we need to do better and more staff allocated to patient care. So we did agree on nursing home reforms to require nursing homes to spend at least 70% of their revenue on direct resident care, and 40% of their total revenues must be spent on resident facing staff, people who deal with residents. And in addition, we gave additional money to them to help pay for the staff. But one of the lessons learned from the very, very tough early days of COVID is that we did not have enough oversight over our nursing homes, and we did not have enough invested in the patient side across the board. Some obviously did an extraordinary job and others did not. So this is a big deal. We also obviously put money into continued COVID response, as there is at the federal level, obviously in the American Rescue Plan. There's a lot of money on COVID response, and I will mention it. Two other things. We did begin the process of legalizing mobile sports betting, which exists in New Jersey and is a boondoggle for them. Whatever you think about gambling, the fact is, New Yorkers are using the New Jersey model to do online sports betting. We started the process of going to ultimately allow that in New York. And while we did not authorize full gaming at, for example, MGM in Yonkers and Aqueduct in Queens, we began the conversation to move towards that, which would be a great economic driver, not only for Southern Westchester, but also for Northern Westchester, providing revenue and jobs, something that I fought hard for. I think now, obviously, we did enact some tax increases, which Chris, maybe you want to go through, or else I will. We did not enact all the tax increases that some of our colleagues wanted. And at the same time, I think we obviously did more than other people would have liked. But the goal was to have some ongoing revenues that we know are dependable, because we're not going to have this COVID money forever. And there will be a cliff when you get all this money and then it's no longer there. We need some predictable ongoing sources of revenue. So we increased the current top state personal income tax rate, which is 8.82%, to 9.65% for individual filers whose income is over $1 million and joint filers over $2 million. And we established two new brackets for those whose income is between 5 million and 25 million, and for those who's above 25 million. That is adjusted gross income, not assets. It's not, it's a, it's a discrete number of people. We, I think, made a more progressive income tax system, which most of us believe is correct. We recognize that some people don't like it. That goes with the nature of this job. But I think overall, our goal was to have a reasonable tax increase that led to predictable future income. And we also increased the corporate franchise tax rate by less than 1%, but it is for companies over $5 million in income. So that's a significant, companies that are doing quite well. I think I'll stop there, Chris, on that issue.
One thing in talking about personal income taxes, I also think that it bears mention that we pushed back on the governor's executive proposal to suspend the phase-in of middle-class tax cuts. And we did have a budget agreement with the governor that keeps that phase-in in place. And in 2021, which is the fourth year of the multi-year tax cuts that were enacted in 2016, income tax rates have been lowered from 6.09% to 5.97% for taxpayers filing jointly in the 43,000 to 161,550 income bracket, and from 6.41% to 6.33% between 161,550 and 323,200 income bracket, And so those cuts are expected to save 4.8 million New Yorkers over $2.2 billion this year. Now, when the cuts are fully phased in, middle-class taxpayers will have received an income tax rate cut up to 20%, amounting to a projected 4.2 billion in annual savings for 6 million filers by 2025. And that will be the state's lowest middle-class tax rates in more than 70 years. So we are pleased with that. We think that that's where the tax cut should be focused. And also returning now for a moment to property tax relief. Clearly what we discussed in terms of money going to school districts, that helps to take pressure off school taxes. The funds that are being provided for local roads is taking pressure off municipalities on municipal taxes. And what we're also having in here is what they call a real property tax circuit breaker. And what that provides is a credit on the state income tax returns for incomes up to $250,000. And that's where the total property tax will exceed a fixed percentage, actually 6% of the income of the taxpayers. And we know that we here in Westchester County, with some spectacularly high property taxes, that is going to mean something to those of us here in the suburbs. And though the total credit is capped at $350, at least we feel that it's going in the right direction. And that's what we need to do, is, as Shelley was mentioning, we need to shift more of the burden off of property taxes and up at the state level to the greatest extent that we can. And we're getting there. It's going to take time. But we think that we're on the right path. And so with that, Shelley, back to you.
So I think what we should do, Chris, because we have about 31 people here, plus some people on Facebook, I know. But there's some discrete questions here, some of which you would know quite well in the questions and answers from folks in Bedford.
Sure.
So can you please discuss any funding for the prisons, and specifically is there funding for the sidewalk to the 2 New York State women's prisons in Bedford Hills, which Chris knows well and I have become to know well. And I would say, and I'll let Chris answer as well, but we are trying very hard to get capital allocated for this. I think that we will be able to complement some of the, hopefully some of the Bedford's ability to contribute, but I think we will be able to find capital to move that project along. That's my 2 cents on that. What do you think, Chris?
Well, I think that's right. And, that's also, again, my thanks goes to Shelley on that. It's another example of the partnership that we have working together, where Shelley on the Senate side, it works to try to get funding, whether it's for Arts Westchester or whether it's for this sidewalk, we're working in partnership on that. And I am optimistic that we're going to have the funding that's needed to enable that to go forward. And the way that would work is that the funding would come through a capital grant that would come from the state, and it would be provided to the town of Bedford that would build it. And of course, it would have to be competitively bid. But, we feel that that's both a cost-effective way of handling it, and it's probably the fastest way of handling it too, by having the municipality install the sidewalk. And in my days as supervisor of the town of Bedford, I was working with our Public Works Commissioner to see if that could be done, and Bedford didn't have the funds for that. And so I said, if I do make it to the State Assembly, I'm going to work on that. And so that's what we're going to try to do this budget cycle.
Yes. Now, I'm going to go to some other questions that are here, either in the chat from people who are present. I know people who signed up also asked some questions, and we'll try to get to them, but I want to respect those who are here. So one question is, does the funding include support for nonprofit cultural institutions? We did two things on that. One, we got the 1 million for Arts Westchester. That's primarily for small grants they've traditionally done, but they really know how important those small grants, $5,000 to each of these local arts groups is. But also we did increase the funding to the New York State Council on the Arts. So both of those should be potentially available to nonprofits like the Hudson River Museum, which Masha asked that question. Hopefully there will be, we really push for it because I think we all know, and certainly in the district that Chris and I have, you know, whether it's the Katona Art Museum, so many other institutions in our district that really are economic drivers of activity, as well as arts, so important for the arts, which we've missed deeply. So I'm very hopeful there will be additional funding for nonprofit arts institutions like museums. But Chris, maybe you want to add something to that.
Well, no, I think that's right. And, you know, Arts Westchester is considered one of the preeminent arts council throughout New York State. And so the separate funding of $1 million for Arts Westchester, in fact, was supported by the New York Council for the Arts. And it's done in a way so it's not taking any funds from the New York State Council for the Arts. And as Shelley was mentioning, we substantially increased the funding that's going to the State Arts Council. So there are going to be sources of funding both from our local arts council, the Arts Westchester, as well as through the state. And again, to that question, yes, absolutely available for not-for-profits. And as I was mentioning in the discussion of funds for small businesses, arts organizations, theater organizations will also have an opportunity to access small business grants that way as well. And I just want to go back to the importance of what Shelley was mentioning. And yes, we have gotten some criticism about some increases in income taxes, but you know, we felt that it's extremely important to do multi-year planning. And we have to look at, you know, what are the revenue streams going to look like next year and the year after that? And do we have sufficient funding for the programs that we know are so incredibly important to the state and to our district? And that's where it's so important to be responsible about it and to be prudent about it, so that when the federal dollars are spent, the American Rescue Plan pandemic relief dollars are spent, we still have the funds in place. And so we still have a funding stream in place to be able to continue the funding, whether it be for the arts programs, whether it be for people with disabilities and OASIS and the programs that that support them. So many areas of the budget, we want to make sure that the money continues to be there after the federal dollars disappear.
Yeah, I want to just add to that because Chris did mention about Senator Schumer, but I just can't say enough about his leadership in fighting at a very granular level for what we needed. I mean, I was on the phone with his office about how to structure some of the education funding. Their office is so open and really committed to particularly our arts and businesses and so many of these other issues. So I just want to make sure that we acknowledge his leadership. I see, okay, there, Tom Dargan has a good question here about the low-cost broadband for low-income students and seniors is very well written, but will cable refuse to downgrade from high-cost entertainment bundles to low-cost educational packages as in the past? Does the writer know? So let me give a little bit of context. As you know, you may not know, I have a bill that was to have mandatory free broadband for every student in New York State, wherever they live, whether they live in a mobile home park, in a homeless shelter, in a co-op, in a luxury house, as part of the state's constitutional obligation to provide a free common school education. If kids are going to learn at home, my view is that the state has an obligation. And it was funded largely by a surcharge on the New York income of these internet service providers. Well, no surprise, they really couldn't stand my idea, which moved through the education committee and was in the conversation of the budget. So it isn't that they are going to reject this very modest proposal that was adopted. I think they are going to be more than pleased to adopt it because it is a far better alternative from their vantage point, I think, than mine, which is a surcharge on them, requiring them to provide this service for free. I believe that broadband at the end of the day is like water and electricity, and it really ought not to be subject to this competitive marketplace. And that we have to find a way to actually guarantee it to everyone if we expect people to be able to be educated. But this program is funded. One of the disappointments of it is the small megabyte requirement of the program, but it was a compromise. So it's 25 megabytes per second at a discounted rate of $15 for every household that's eligible for SNAP benefits, reduced price school lunch, Medicaid benefits, senior citizen, SCREE, or affordability benefits from a utility. There also is a whole lot of federal money for this kind of income-based broadband program, which is about to be rolled out. So I think they are more than pleased to do this. In fact, many of them were offering this product as a one-off to various school districts and others. So I am not giving up, just so you know, on my idea. I believe the state should have a policy, not what we have here. But my idea did not survive in the budget, and I'll continue to push it. But in the meanwhile, we want to ensure that families that cannot afford broadband have, in my opinion, quality access to broadband, and we'll continue to fight for it. But if there's particular things in the language, it wasn't written by anyone other than legislators. So I would be happy to make sure we get you to somebody who can answer that. We got some nice comments here, Chris, so I think some nice thank yous. So I'm skipping over those.
I'll take the question on the boys. Shelley, I'll take the question on the Boys and Girls Club.
Yeah, sure.
And I had that question actually from a good friend of mine who's a huge supporter of the Boys and Girls Club of Northern Westchester. And I did check on that, and I'm very pleased to report that the budget included $30,000 to the Boys and Girls Club of Northern Westchester for their drug prevention program. And it also included $750,000 for the New York State Alliance for Boys and Girls Clubs. So there too, that's again, pressing to make sure that these organizations that do such a great job can continue to have the means to do so. So yes, there is that funding. There is also the question about the timeline for opening of applications for the rental assistance program and the excluded worker fund. I don't have a timeline at this point, but I can tell you that in the budget hearings, both the members of the Assembly Housing Committee, I'm on that committee, as well as our colleagues and counterparts on the Senate, made it abundantly clear how important it was to get those dollars out there as quickly as possible, because we know that people are struggling, and small landlords, by the way, are struggling. And I want to make it clear too that small landlords are going to have the opportunity to get some of these funds, because sometimes, what will happen is the tenant will leave, and then meanwhile the operating costs for that small landlord continue on. How are they going to pay their mortgage? How are they going to pay the utilities? And so it will be available for smaller landlords. So I wanted to make that point as well.
I want to add one thing to that. During the course of the height of COVID, we had a housing relief package that was also for landlords and tenants to be able to avoid evictions and to make sure landlords had, as Chris said, the money they needed to meet operating expenses, and that tenants weren't fearful they were going to be evicted the moment the courts reopened and the moratorium was over. One of the problems was the point that I think the questioner is raising. We don't, not we, the executive agencies of the governor do not get the money out the door fast enough. And so one thing that was done in this very generous 2.4 billion in COVID-19 emergency rental assistance program with 12 months arrears for rent and utilities is they moved it away from HCR, the Housing and Community Renewal, to a different agency, OTADA, which has hopefully more capacity to get the money out the door. To Chris's point, we don't want to fight for these things that we need for our district and then find the money is sitting somewhere. And so the timeline for the opening of applications for the rental assistance program has not been set. And for the excluded workers fund, which we can discuss, that is a fund that we have funded for those who are not eligible for unemployment, not only undocumented, sometimes a family with mixed documentation status, but where a person can prove they were working or lost income as a result of COVID, with sufficient proof of basically an ITIN number or some other proof that they paid taxes, they would be eligible for about $15,000 in a lump sum, less taxes, less state income taxes. And if they were able to prove less than that, basically if they lost income, but they do not have the tax and other receipts necessary, but still can prove residency and loss of income, they would be eligible for about a $3,500 check, less taxes again. And that is really cash replacement for the fact that these folks and we all know them and they all live among us and they are our neighbors and they have been working in our communities all this time, but they were not eligible for not only unemployment, none of the stimulus payments, nor any other cash subsistence during this time. And I think we've seen firsthand in our food pantries and in our other places that these are the folks who have really just been struggling to basically survive at home, to have their kids at home, to have no income, to have food, diapers, and the things they needed. So again, I'm very open to the fact that some people think this is unacceptable. I don't want to speak for Chris. For myself, I think it is the morally right thing to do. These individuals live among us. It's too bad the federal government has not fixed our immigration policy, that people who are living here and working ought not to be eligible. But we can't turn away from these people in our communities and not figure some way to help them through this terrible pandemic. And so the rules for that, which are set by the Department of Labor, need to be reviewed by the Attorney General, and the program is audited by the Comptroller's Office. So there's a lot of oversight and there's quite a bit of proof requirements, is not yet operational. And the application process, I don't believe, will be open until they can get all that in line. It's going to take a little while. I don't know if you want to say anything further about that program, Chris.
No, I'd like to. This is a program that, as Shelley was mentioning, I think it morally is the right thing to do. And these are our neighbors, as Shelley has mentioned. These are folks who've been working. These are folks who take care of our lawns, who take care of our children. And those are those people, that group of people have been disproportionately hit and slammed by the pandemic. And just as we know that small businesses have been disproportionately hit and felt that it was so extremely important to provide funding for them, here's another group that has been disproportionately hit. And we feel it's the right thing to do in a civilized society. And so I strongly supported the program. I think it's the right thing to do. And I think it's going to be administered just fine. I really do. As Shelley had mentioned, a lot of rules are going to be in place to make sure that it's done properly, that there's proper oversight. And I think it's, and actually those dollars too just as the dollars I was talking about in terms of coming back into the economy, there's going to be a large multiplier effect there too. Those dollars are going to help to support all manner of sectors of our economy, and it's going to be very important to help bring us back.
There's a question here, which I think is worth, I'm glad it was asked. The early retirement incentive was pulled out of the budget at the last minute. So what happened is many of us supported the early retirement incentive to be statewide and not just in the city of New York. What had happened in the city of New York is there was the very direct threat of layoffs earlier during COVID, and the unions negotiated a lesser amount of benefit in anticipation of layoffs. So they actually gave up something real at the table. Then it turned out layoffs were not going to be necessary because they got a lot of federal money and they got state money. So there was it was actually employees in New York City who were in the retirement plans were in a more disadvantaged situation. I think that, and we know that there are so many people in Westchester and statewide who really saw this. COVID was a game changer. They would like to have retired. Maybe they had a year left. Certainly teachers wanted it, and many other public employees. We were unable to get enough support from everyone that we needed. It's a three-part thing, this budget. It still is the Senate, the Assembly, and the governor. They all have to agree. And we were not able to get it. There's still pressure for it, but don't forget, municipalities can do what George Latimer wisely did, which, while it doesn't buy back a year in your pension system, he created a fund to incentivize people to take early retirement. I think about 60 did. He was able to reduce the workforce and give people the opportunity to retire earlier than they might have otherwise. So I'm still going to be pushing for it. Jagdish, I don't know that we'll get it, but I know Pete was very strong in it, and we had many colleagues in the Assembly, and I'd like to see it happen. I know this year many people wanted it. It's disappointing to me. Chris, do you want to add anything on that?
No, I think you covered it well, and I have the same position as you do on this, and hopefully, we'll have success for it going forward. But unfortunately, we could not get it into the budget, and that actually goes to another question that came up about the subsidy for fossil fuels, and that's another thing that we were unable to get in the budget in terms of removing those fossil fuel subsidies. I happen to feel that if we're going to be consistent with the requirements under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, then we have to remove these kind of subsidies as soon as we can. If they're going to be subsidies, they should be going to the areas of renewable energy, and that's what we need to be stimulating and promoting to the greatest extent possible. So to Susan, that is certainly something that I'm going to be pressing forward on in the future and through legislation, just as I oppose any new fossil fuel powered electric plants. All of those are in the same category of going in the wrong direction when we need to do everything possible in order to treat the climate crisis as the crisis that it truly is.
I just want to acknowledge the nice compliments. It's so generous. Legal Services of Hudson Valley. Yes, Chris and I both fought for that. We so appreciate what you do. Abigail, thank you for your comment. And so some other nice comments. Susan, thank you very much. Sharon Ballin asked about healthcare workers who deserve to be treated the same as veterans. I want to reference another issue we were unable to resolve, but is very important to me, and I suspect to Chris, which is home care workers in outside of particularly those that take care of disabled and senior people in their home. We really tried in the Hudson Valley to put a push to get these folks above minimum wage. I'm sure that if you have loved ones, parents or others, or you have disabled members of your family that are at home, you know what a struggle it is to find people who can do this very difficult job. They do it really out of devotion because you can make a higher wage elsewhere. And so there's a movement. We did not get there, but like most of these movements, and many of you on here know this, it takes a lot of work to build a coalition to force change. They really got this issue front and center, that we need to support home care workers, and particularly those who, many who are not in a union, so they don't have the benefit of collectively bargained wages and benefits. And so I think we're going to continue to push that. It was a disappointment, but overall, I think people should take away the sense that it was a historic budget in the sense that the legislators, like myself and Chris and our colleagues, were able to drive a very positive change in a time of great turmoil that I think puts New York on a firm footing. We feel very, very good about what we've achieved. It's not perfect, but it's far, far in a whole different category than many of the years of the budgets I've lived through, and many of us. I know there's one or two other questions that were sent earlier. One of them is about the American Rescue Plan money for municipalities. Every town, I think it's a town, or every town, city, and the state is getting money directly under the American Rescue Plan. There's a book, I encourage you to get it online, from Senator Schumer, called New York State and Local Aid Explainer. It lists every municipality and how much money they're going to get. This is really going to provide opportunities. The decisions about how to use this money is largely up to the municipality, subject to some limitations in federal law. But this is an enormous boon for our towns and villages, as you would have said, Chris, as a former supervisor, to have this, sort of land in your lap. It's just a fantastic thing. So someone asked about the use of the money, but the money would be determined by the municipality, and they have a great deal of latitude in how they use it. So that is one thing I want people to know. Two other things that were asked: why are schools scheduled to receive only 60% of the aid? Because it's the question, I think, is a little not accurate. How could we get to 60%? We've been trying to get to that for 15 years. We finally got the money, and with the revenue we created, the ability to move towards 60%, to get to 60% for everybody, and move to 80 and 100%. This is the path forward we never had, with a commitment, including a commitment by the governor, who has been resistant to foundation aid, to move in the right direction. So nothing is perfect, in state budgets, but this is a very exciting move forward. Chris, do you have other things you want to say?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add, in the question of adjusting the pay that go to low-income workers that do so much to help provide human services. And one of the things that we were pressing for in various areas of the budget are cost of living adjustments. And so, for example, in the Office of Addiction Services and Supports, we have a cost of living adjustments for human services providers there for the coming fiscal year. We have it as well in the Office of Mental Health. We have it as well in another human services COLA that I mentioned, mental health, but in several different areas. I know that in programs that serve the physically and the developmentally and physically disabled, there are increases there as well. And so that's an example of what we're trying to achieve, to bring people up in what their pay is, because so many of these folks, they're not earning that much more than someone at a fast food restaurant would be earning. And that's not the way we should be providing for their compensation. So much of what we've been trying to do is to deal with the many, many years of austerity budgets and provide for investments for the future. One other thing that I should mention is that the great deal of money that Senator Schumer was able to get for New York follows many, many, many years of New York being a net exporter of dollars to the federal government. You take Kentucky, that given who the majority leader was there, they did pretty well over the years in getting a lot more money from the federal government than Kentucky gave to the federal government. So we're really not getting a windfall in the sense of getting something more than is merited, but instead it's to provide some equity.
I know there is this question about additional funding for women's shelter and rape and abuse. I believe, I don't have it on top of my list here. Maybe Chris has it easier. I believe we did increase the funding for women's shelter and domestic violence shelters directly. Rape and abuse counseling, I would have to check. Do you know the answer?
We did restore $147,000 in support for rape crisis centers, and that's for a total funding of $6.5 million. So again, this is another area in which there was going to be a cut, and we restored that cut, the funds that were going to be cut. So I know that we have that. And there may be other areas in the budget in which we had provided for that.
One little technical thing for people to understand is there are areas in the budget, and it's not one bill. There's a multiplicity of bills that are the budget. It's not one bill that is voted on. And in some of them, there's something like a lump sum at the bottom where other things are included and not referenced by name. For example, things that I asked for, I asked for money for the 250th commemoration of celebration that is going to be forthcoming, and there's a big movement in New York to create a on the history of the end of slavery, and there's going to be a statewide effort on this, and it's going to be matched by federal dollars, but we needed some state dollars. Those state dollars are not lined out in the budget. They're not referenced by name, but they're in there in one of these unappropriated sums. So it's a complicated thing to piece through. If people have questions, they certainly can contact Chris's office or mine. I will put my government email here, and Chris can put his. And I want to also say that for myself, I'm going to be doing several more of these with my other assembly counterparts, one with Assemblyman Steve Otis, one with Assemblyman Nader Sage, at least, and probably more coming. But the opportunity to talk about the budget, to answer questions, is something that I've always done, and I believe this is a big, complicated, very expensive use of state dollars and of our dollars, our taxpayer dollars, and people are entitled to have their questions answered as well as we can, given the complexity of it. So with that, I want to thank Lily McFarland of my staff, who's done the technical part of this, and my Chief of Staff, Rachel Estroff. I have a fantastic team who have been with me, many of them since I was in the Assembly, and our office in Portchester is still only remote, is not open full-time for people to come, but feel free to email me and we will do our best to get back to you and be as responsive as possible. And it truly is an honor to serve, even in these tough times, or even more so in these tough times. We have an obligation to do the best we can, and thank you for giving us that opportunity. Turn it back to you, Chris.
Well, thank you, Shelley. And I will also have an upcoming town hall with State Senator Pete Harcum, who serves the northern portion of my district. And I also, for those who don't see it in the question and answer, just I'll read this off. Shelley's email is smayer, M-A-Y-E-R, @nysenate.gov. That's smayer, M-A-Y-E-R, @nysenate.gov. And mine is Burdick, B-U-R-D-I-C-K, C @nyassembly.gov. And I want to give a shout out to my fabulous Chief of Staff, Heather Lackey, who just hit the ground running, and also my Communications Director, Jackie Mishler, who has done just a fabulous job of putting together the newsletter and Facebook posts and Twitter and everything possible to get the word out. And so if there are questions that we didn't answer, please come back to us. That's what we're here for. We're here to serve you. And it's a tremendous honor to be in the New York State Assembly. And I thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you so much, everybody. And I think good night. Is that right, Lily?
Good night, everyone. Thanks again for joining us.